to tell the story. First and last stanzas. 424.
Jesus the Savior. Thank you, Miss Yvonne. And once again, I thank you for coming out. One of the most comforting things is when you have friends and family that come and support. And one of the scariest things is when you have friends and family come support. And so I thank you so much. And and we all know Jeremiah. And so he doesn't need any introduction. I'll just go ahead and turn it over to him.
Good evening. Thank you for all coming. I'll be reading from Psalms chapter 52. If you can turn to that and please stand. Psalms chapter 52. And I'll be starting in verse 1. And it says, "Why boastest thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. Thy tongue deviseth mischiefs like a sharp razor, working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than to speak righteousness. Selah. Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. God shall likewise destroy thee forever. He shall take thee away and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place, and root thee out of the land of the living. Selah. The righteous also shall see and fear, and shall laugh at him. Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and strengthened himself in his wickedness. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise thee forever and ever, because thou hast done it, and I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints." Please bow your heads. Dear God, thanks for bringing us all out here. Please speak through me and use me so that everyone in this building may be touched tonight. Please give us safe travel and grace home, and help us as we complete all of our tasks throughout the week. In Jesus' name pray. Amen. Now, Psalms 52 was written by David as he was fleeing from King Saul. Now, King Saul had sons who were supposed to inherit the throne. However, King Saul disobeyed God twice. So God said instead of punishing him, he's just going to throw his family out of being reigned as kings. So he went and they found a new king, and it was David. Now, David was already anointed to become king, but King Saul didn't like that, and he wanted his sons to become the king. So what King Saul did was he set out to go kill David. Now, fleeing from King Saul, David was going to the Philistine city called Gath. Now, on his way to Gath, he went to this town called Nob, and that is where this passage of Psalms will take place. In Nob, he went and asked Achimelech for bread and sword, acting as he was on a mission from King Saul. Now, being there, this head shepherd for King Saul was named Doeg. He was an Edomite, and while there, and he heard about this, he went back immediately and told King Saul what was going on. Hearing this, King Saul said, "Okay, order for Achimelech, who was a high priest, to be killed." The servants of King Saul would not do this, but Doeg, what he had was what we would call greed and ambition. Now, with this greed and ambition, Doeg took the opportunity to go and said, "Hey, I'll do it for you." So King Saul said, "Okay." With this happening, Doeg went and killed Achimelech, 84 priests, and every citizen in Nob. Now, Psalms 52 is broken down into three main sections. The first is verses 1 through 4, which I'll now be reading. It says, "Why boastest thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. Thy tongue devises mischiefs like a sharp razor, working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than speak righteousness. Selah. Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue." Now, in verse 1 it says, "Why boastest thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man?" Now, David recognizes Doeg as a mighty man because of his newfound inheritance of power from King Saul for what he did. And then he goes on to say, "The goodness of God endureth continually." Now, in verse 1, he's contrasting God and Doeg. He's calling Doeg a mighty man, but saying that God's goodness endures continually and does not stop. Then he goes on to say, "Thy tongue devises mischiefs like a sharp razor, working deceitfully." Now, if you'll turn with me to Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21, you can see that it says, "Death and life are in power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof." Next, I'll go to Proverbs chapter 12, verse 18. And it says, "There is that speaketh like piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise is health." Now, these two both talk about the power of the tongue and what it can do. In Proverbs chapter 18, it talks about death and life are in the power of the tongue. You can either build someone up or you can tear them down with using the words of your tongue. Whenever you say something, you can't take it back. And whenever Doeg went and lied about Achimelech, he went and took the lives of everyone in Nob. In chapter 12 of Proverbs, it says, "There's that speaketh like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise is health." It's saying that healthy living can come from the tongue, but also it can be a piercing of a sword, meaning that it can have power. It does have power. In verse 3 it says, "Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than speak righteousness." Selah. Now in the end of verse 3 you'll see that it says Selah. And I went and I looked it up, and Selah is telling you to pause and look at what this verse is saying. And what it's saying is that Doeg, who David is writing the psalm about, is about how he loves evil more than good and lying rather than to speak righteousness. He's saying that he loves being evil more than doing good. So he would rather be selfish and greedy and ambitious than helping others. And it says that you would rather lie than to speak righteousness. Now, whenever he goes on to say this, he's using what he did with the Achimelech and the people of Nob to show that he would rather lie than to do right and do what God had given him and be content in being the head shepherd. Because being a shepherd back then was frowned upon, because they stunk, they stayed up all night, they had to sleep in the gate, they could give up their lives for their sheep. Just wasn't the highest of jobs, and Doeg wanted a higher paying job. Now, in verse 4 it says, "Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue." In verse 4 it's talking about about the power of the tongue and how it can devour someone. A tongue, as you can see in chapter 18 of Proverbs, "There is that speaketh like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise is health." That is just again another reference for you to use. The second part of this psalm in 52 is verses 5 through 7. "God shall likewise destroy thee forever. He shall take thee away and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place and root thee out of the land of the living." Selah. Now, what it's talking about here in my reference, destroy, is more like beat thee up. And beating Doeg up, about God beating Doeg up, isn't a literal beating him up all the time. What it's talking about is picking him up, taking him away, and plucking him out of the dwelling place, which is heaven, and root thee out of the land of the living, which is heaven, and the dwelling place is God's kingdom. Now, beating him would be him burning in hell for the rest of eternity. Now, we are told to reflect upon this verse once again. In verse 6 it says, "The righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him." Now, right now, what is happening is David is being persecuted by Doeg, and he is on the run, and he's living a pretty hurtful life because he is watching what happened, because he went and asked, and he posed as one of Saul's men, and what happened because of his lie. Now, righteous also shall fear and laugh at him. What's happening is right now Doeg is up here and David's down here. But what it's saying that in the end, God will lift David up and lift all the men of Noab up, and while Doeg is watching, and they will laugh at him because of what he's done. In verse 7, "Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and strengthened himself in his wickedness." Now, in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, it says, "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not upon thy own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths." Now, what it is saying here is that if you trust in yourself, you will not succeed. But if you trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't lean upon your own understanding, he will direct your paths and give you what you desire. Now, what Doeg did was he thought, okay, since I have the opportunity to become a greater man in man's eyes, I'm going to pounce on it. And he trusted in his own understanding, and he let his greed and his ambition overpower him. He trusted in the riches of man and what we would call successfulness. But in God's eyes, that is not what he had planned for Doeg. Doeg went out of his way, and he killed many innocent men, women, and children. It also talks about strengthening himself in wickedness. His wickedness was him going out and strengthening himself by lying to Saul. And he gained all this inheritance from Saul by lying. Now, in verse 8, this is something that I read from a Charles Spurgeon commentary. He said that, I'm like a green olive tree. When Doeg and his brethren shall wither and perish, I, who have made God my refuge, I, whom he despised and persecuted, and thought to be in a desperate condition, shall be established and flourish in the house of God. What he's saying is that right now Doeg, like I said earlier, Doeg is up here and David's down here. But because in the end, we'll all end up in the same place, in the grave. But where we go after that is up to how we live our lives on earth. And after Doeg and his brothers wither and perish, David, who he leaned upon God for his refuge, will ascend into heaven while Doeg is burning in hell. And he has comfort in that. And he also says, in God's church and among his people, or in God's tabernacle, from which Doeg shall be plucked away, but to which I doubt not, I shall be restored. Now, one principal part of the happiness of David promised himself was that he should have a constant admission to the house of God. Now, what he's saying here is that he believes that he has faith in God. See, David, he went through a lot of tough times. He had went, and at one point, while he was being chased, Saul was hiding in a cave. David had snuck in and cut off a piece of his cloak while he was sleeping. Whenever Saul woke up, he saw David and said, you better watch and I'm going to kill you. And David said, I'd watch what you say. And he held up that piece of cloak. And Saul looked and he saw that he had spared him. Now, David, he trusts in God. And instead of killing him right there, he knew that God had a plan and he wasn't going to go out of his way and just take the kingdom right there. He was going to allow God to intervene and do however God wanted Saul to die. And he trusted in him. Now, in verse 9, it talks about, I will praise thee forever because thou hast done it, and I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, it says, lay not up for your own treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. Here's talking about, don't put your faith in worldly things. Don't put your faith in things that we see as successful. Don't worry about things like that. He says, but put yourselves in treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor dust corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. Now, nowadays, we all know what it's like to have something stolen, I'm sure. And he's saying that in heaven, everything is guarded and everything is prosperous. And he goes on to say that, and I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints. What he's saying here is that he has faith because God, his kingdom will sustain and his kingdom will not end. Now, the whole point of Psalms 52 was a psalm about Doeg. Doeg was a liar, he was a murderer, and he was ambitious. And that is three flaws of Doeg. Now, I'd like to go back to verse 8. He compares himself to an olive tree. And he says that a green olive tree in the house of God. Now, green is usually associated with prospering and flourishing and being useful. Now, the olive tree is one of the most useful trees because of its fruit. And he's painting the picture like his future, instead of being negative, he's saying, you know what, my future, I'm placing my trust in God, like he said. He's saying that it's going to be joyful, glorious, and it's going to last. And he says that it will be useful and pleasing to men. Now, why would he talk about the house of God here? He might he might be talking about a dwelling place where he knows he will reside. And he was now being exiled, and he was on the run, and Doeg was after him. But in the end, he says that he does not worry about it because he has faith in God. One thing that we can think about in verse 9 is what God has done for us, what he will do, and why he would do this for us. Now, sometimes you go through situations in life and you think, okay, well, look at that guy, look what he has done, and look at me. I'm a good Christian, I go to church, I do what God asks. He's a murderer, but he got away with it and all this. He's a bad person in our eyes. Well, don't question God, because God has a plan for you. See, whenever we question God, then that makes it look like we're asking him, we're perfect. Why are you doing this to us? Neither of us are perfect, but God has a plan for you, and God has a reason for putting you what you're going through, and a reason for him going through what he's going through. And much like here, we might be David, and that man might be Doeg, while we might be down here, and that person's up here. In the end, we'll be on top, because we will be in heaven with God. Now, in verse 1, I'd like to go back to that real quick. He says, "Why boastest thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually." This can coincide with verse 9, because it says that God's goodness endureth continually. Now, if we truly believe that his goodness endureth continually, we wouldn't question God and what he's doing. We all have a purpose, and we all have a reason. And we all have to trust God and have that faith in him. Now, back to Matthew chapter 6, he says that laying not your treasures upon earth. Now, your treasures upon earth, it's not a sin to want more. In fact, God talks about how he wants us to want more. He wants us to do everything that we can. But it has to be in his will. Because if it isn't, and we keep on, it's only going to lead to us failing. We might succeed, but in the end, we will fail, because God always wins. Now, whenever you think about it, Doeg, even though he had done many wicked things, and he had persecuted David, killed innocent men, women, and children, and then he lied to King Saul to get all of his riches, but then David, which unlike most of us in this situation, he didn't ask God why. He just praised God and asked what he had done for him, else he could do for him, and he pledged his faith to God forever and ever. We also have to do this. Like, whenever the going gets rough, you got to flow. In conclusion, I just want you to know that you have a purpose in life, and I want you to know that you do stand a purpose for God, and even though you may feel this big, to him, in his eyes, you're the size of the whole earth. And as Miss Stacy and Miss Yvonne walk up, I just have one more question for you. Stop asking God why something is happening and start asking him, what can I do for you? Thank you.